Greetings, friends! Welcome back. If you're new, make sure you hit that subscribe button so we can continue talking about books together. But for today, I wanted to talk about my top 7 picks in the fantasy sci-fi genre. That is my top tier reading area aside from mystery right now. Third is probably classics. These are the books that have made it onto my favorites list in the fantasy genre. Even if they didn't have space on my favorites shelf, these books fall under favorites in the sci-fi and fantasy genre. So the first one I'm going to talk about, I'm not going in any particular order right now. I just have them stacked in order of heftiness on the little shelf in front of me. But the most recent series that I have started is The Realm of the Enderlings by Robin Hobb, and I really enjoyed my time in the Farseer trilogy, which is Assassin's Apprentice, Royal Assassin, and Assassin's Quest. This trilogy starts off strong, in my opinion. It really creates a bond with the main character, Fitz. Fitz is not necessarily an orphan, but he is abandoned at the entry of a castle. His father is a prince, but he hasn't recognized that Fitz is his son. He doesn't really know that he exists. At a very young age, he is taken to grow up in a castle setting and to be trained. He's not exactly early in line for kingship by any means, but his identity is kept somewhat secret because his father is one of the 3 princes who are in line for the throne. It's much disputed whether this book is the weakest in this trilogy, but I personally found it to be really endearing and it made me want to pick up the rest of the trilogy. So after reading the first book, I had initially been reading from the special edition hardcovers, and they're a little hard to wield as far as like reading experience goes. And so I decided I would start my paperback collection of this series, and I got the first 3 after I had read the first 1.5. So I continued in the paperbacks, and it was a much better reading experience, I will say. I think this one is actually the strongest in my opinion because I didn't particularly enjoy book 3 as much, but it is the place to start. I finished this trilogy earlier this year, and I'm really looking forward to diving into the next set of 3, which is the Live Ship Traders, and that starts with the Ship of Magic. The next book is one that has been a favorite since I was a kid, and I still love it. I still think that it lives up to the hype, and it is well deserving of its Newbery Honor Award, and that is Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine. I really love this author, and it all started with this book, Ella Enchanted. In Ella Enchanted, our main character has been cursed from birth to be obedient. When Ella was just a baby, a fairy blessed her with the ability, also curse, to be obedient. So the well-meaning fairy wanted her to be a respectful and lovely child, but that ended up being quite the curse for her because she has to do what anyone tells her to do. And so we're following her as she grows up, and she is looking for a solution to this problem because she could harm herself or harm others without wanting to because of this curse. And so she seeks to find the fairy who established that curse and make things right. I would say if you've only seen the adaptation of this book in the Ella Enchanted by Miramax Films with Anne Hathaway. I love Anne Hathaway, but I think you have to read this book for yourself because there's just so much more to it. She has abilities that are really amazing as a character. Like, she can communicate to different creatures in their own languages, and I think that's something that like we don't really see in the movie. And the movie also is like, let's be honest, it's a completely different tone. It's very comedic, there's musical comedy, and it just doesn't it doesn't really match with the tone of this book, and it's a very short read, so I think you should pick it up. If you want something that is in a very similar vein to Ella Enchanted, but actually is completely comedy, you're going to want to pick up The Princess Bride. This is another one where I love the movie adaptation, and the book isn't necessarily better, but I think if you watch the movie, it's going to enhance your experience of reading the book. And you can't say that for a lot of books, but you can for this one, The Princess Bride by William Goldman. There's just something so nostalgic about this book because of the movie, and I have seen the movie so many times, you guys. I have seen it like at least 30, I think, at least 30 times. It's just a fantasy that doesn't take itself too seriously, so you'll identify some common tropes in fantasy in this book. It's more than a love story, it's more than a quest story. It is the quintessential fantasy story. Another outstanding fantasy novel, which has an animated film that is well worth your time, is Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. I'm still working my way through the trilogy that is Howl's Moving Castle, Castle in the Air, and The House of Many Ways. But I have read this one, I really enjoyed it, and I added it to my favorite shelf immediately. In this story, we're following Sophie, who has the great misfortune to have been cursed. You know, can you see a pattern in my favorite books? The main character often has the unfortunate problem of being cursed, and they have to figure out a way to resolve that. So Sophie has been cursed to be an old lady, and it basically is a reflection of her old soul personality. She's a little bit complaining, she's a little bit critical, and that kind of becomes her identity. And so when her identity is shown in her body, she has to seek a cure. And so she finds herself wandering into the realm of Howl, who has this notoriously amazingly steampunk moving castle. It has legs, it transports itself from one realm to another. And so Sophie wanders into this home. Her desire to have things all neat and tidy takes over, and so she becomes the cleaning woman for this home, and she feels like no one can see the true her. Even if you find yourself not loving the Howl-Sophie dynamic, there's a lot of different side characters and dynamics to love about this book, and I really think you should pick it up. This next one is going to be real cliche for the genre, but I love The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. I don't have the original dust jacket from this edition, but it is a really nice, compact, hefty hardback. If you didn't know, this book was originally meant to be published in one volume, but it set the tone for publishing by deciding, like, this is too heavy of a book, this is too much for one, let's make more money by making more books. And so it kind of pioneered the idea of a fantasy series, and that's where we get that from. So you can find The Lord of the Rings obviously in like 3-volume editions, but I personally really love that my copy is all in one volume because that was the original intent for that series, to be read back to back. And I did do that for the first time last year, and I loved my time. I think going from one to the other is really great because you are following that quest story and you don't get the distraction of like years going by in between when you stop after the Fellowship or stop after the Two Towers. If you progress to the Return of the King, it really is delightful. So I don't think I really need to tell you about the hero's journey in this story or why you should pick it up, because maybe you already have read it. Chances are, if you're watching my channel, you've already read this and loved it, or maybe it's not your favorite, but you still agree that it is a foundation of the genre. So we're gonna move on. One area of fantasy that I particularly love my time in is middle grade. And I can't think of a better example of this than the recent debut series. It starts with Amari and the Night Brothers, and then the second book is called Amari and the Great Game, which I also have, I read, and I loved, and I can't wait for the next book, which is coming out this fall, I believe. I already have it pre-ordered. In this series, we're following Amari. Amari lives in the inner city with her mom and her older brother, Quentin, and she loves and respects her older brother. They have an amazing relationship. When Amari's older brother, Quentin, goes missing, she's determined to find out what happened, and she receives a mysterious invitation to a place that she never knew existed, and that is the Bureau of Supernatural Affairs. Amari will have to prove herself by completing classes and trials so that she is sorted into an ability. Amari knows little about the world that she's just entered and the different ways that people are distinguished, but she quickly finds out that the ideal is definitely not being a magician, because magicians have been the enemies of the magical world for many years, and one of the greatest villains in the history of this supernatural society was a magician. When Amari takes her test, she discovers that she falls into this undesirable category of being a magician, and so there's a lot of discrimination, there's a lot of suspicion and fear from the people around her, and so she has to overcome that. It's an amazing picture of what people of color have to deal with on an everyday basis from society that they live in, not just have just stumbled upon. And I think that B.B. Alston is an author to watch. Currently it's a duology. If you haven't picked up these two books, I definitely recommend checking them out. They would be awesome to read to your middle grade, even a little bit younger, I would say. It would be a really fun bedtime read. But this book is also just very beautiful. There's some really nice metallic foiling happening on this one. The illustration is so impactful, and I just really love the typography as well in this edition. The foil continues on the actual hardback. Broken crystal ball and pages. And then to tie it all together, the pages on the top and the side are covered in a silver paint. Again, we have like the broken crystal ball on the back of the book. Illustration as a chapter heading for each chapter, which I love. Last but not least, a book that I don't currently own, but I definitely recommend you pick up as part of fantasy. This one steps a little bit more into sci-fi in my opinion, but that is The Last Quintista. I loved this book. I read it, I would say, toward the middle end of last year, and in this book we have space travel, we have a main character who is thrown into circumstances beyond her control, and she has the stories of her abuelita in mind, and they are what empower her to be able to survive in the circumstances that she's thrown into. But I have to say, like, for this one, I don't want to give anything away. If you haven't read it before, it's really more enjoyable if you go in not knowing anything. But I definitely recommend you read it. Give The Last Quintista a read. So those are my 7 picks from the fantasy sci-fi genre, and I know it was more heavy on fantasy this time around, but I know that this is going to always evolve throughout the years because it's one of my favorite genres. How about you? What's your favorite book that falls into the fantasy sci-fi category? I'd love to know. Please comment below, and I will definitely take your reading recommendations. Also, if you have a completely different favorite genre, let me know what your favorite genre is below. Until next time, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you're notified when I post my next video. And if you like this video, if you like my recommendations, do me a favor and hit that like button. I look forward to continuing to talk about books with you in my next video.